Welcome to this seminar on children's rights in the wake of the pandemic. I'm Stefan Swartling-Petersen. I'm a professor of global transformations for health at Karolinska Institutet, a medical university in Sweden, and a health specialist with UNICEF Sweden. I'm being joined today by a very distinguished panel here. Who are you, sir?
Global Innovation Director for UNICEF.
And lady?
I am the Secretary General of UNICEF Sweden.
And you have a name?
Pernilla Barant. Not so important.
Yes. Sorry.
And I'm Carl Björkman. I'm the head of Nordics for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation.
Wonderful. So we're here to discuss children's rights. Virtually the entire world has signed on to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and which actually gives children's rights to life and a future and development and all sorts of nice things. But then, as we all vividly remember, something called the COVID pandemic hit. And for me, I actively and my family, we sponsor 4 children to go to school in Uganda. They were sent home and their schools were closed down for 2 years. During which time they were home in the village and there was actually no training whatsoever. And we have seen many global statistics of the like of immunization coverage is going down, childbirth in hospitals going down. So we've seen a big pandemic crisis for children's rights, if you will. And then on top of the many wars and hunger in the world, in the last few months we've added new conflicts also in Europe that have added refugees. We've added a food security crisis, a fuel crisis, a finance crisis, and multiple crises that actually all translate to a children's health and development crisis. So on that somber note, we're here today with this distinguished panel actually to see what it will take to get out of this and what can we do? Can innovation help? What can we do in service delivery? And how do we get out of this? So I wanted to start with you, Pernilla. Can you sort of paint the picture a bit more than what I did for children now in the present, in the face of these multiple crises?
Yes, thank you. And I think it is so important that even though the pandemic didn't hit children first and foremost, there should actually be a breaking news right now about the learning poverty increases in the world. There was a summit last weekend in Paris. It was UNICEF, the World Bank, and UNESCO that 70% of 10-year-olds in low and middle-income countries cannot read a simple text. The pandemic has caused, due to the school closures, and we were already very off targets on Agenda 2030 before the pandemic. We have a global learning crisis. And in addition to this, of course, a lot of the vaccinations program, the routine vaccinations program for children were stopped, and we saw an increase in mental health problems. So the children are facing a difficult time. And actually for UNICEF, it's the first time since we started to measure that child labor is going up and child marriage is going up. So the school, as we know, is much more than just a learning context. It is a safe place and a safeguarding protection place for children. So we have a lot to deal with. And the first thing is to know that we have to deal with all of this.
Thank you. But Carl, we know the Gates Foundation is very interested in children's health and development around the world. But why are you here in Sweden?
Well, the role of philanthropy is really to do things that others can't or won't do. We're a fairly big foundation. Last year we dispersed around $6 billion, which is a lot of money. It's about what Sweden gave out in ODA. But of course, we're not a country. We're not part of the UN system. We don't have a big diplomatic court service. But we also have some strengths that a country doesn't have. So it's the Nordics, but Sweden and the other Nordics are also development champions. They punch above their weight. The government does a lot of good. There's a lot of great stuff that Sida and NORAD and Danida and others do. And there's also a very lively and thriving private sector, as well as looking around, we are amazing world-class civil society and NGOs. So being based in the Nordics enables us to build partnerships in an easier way, to find ways where we can sort of do things that couldn't be done otherwise.
So the newest entrant actually to the organizational space here is represented by Thomas Davin here. You head UNICEF Office of Innovation. So what's this innovation about? And can you get us out of the mess for children that Pernilla described?
Well, let's see. That's why we're here. So indeed, when we talk about the latest pandemic and the impact on children, we label that, we frame it as a crisis for children. Of course, the pandemic has impacted everyone, but we have seen such incredible impact for children. More than 100 million children have gone back to deep poverty. We have learning crisis losses. We have mental health. And when we look at mental health, for instance, one of the challenges we have is that we can only right now identify less than 15% of children and young people with mental health issues. So it's not just that we have these issues, we know that they're there. Some of them we don't really know how to even frame them, find them. So the role of the Office of Innovation is a little bit the magician at a prestigious theater, is to find the white rabbit and pull the white rabbit out of the hat. It's essentially trying to look for new partnership, to look for solutions that are being tested, maybe by the civil society or the Vinnova partners that are here. Look for institutions to co-ideate with us and then go and test them in the global south. Does that work in Ghana? Does that work in Indonesia? Would it be better if it came from a Brazil solution? How do we know? What do we know about what WHO is doing? And does that work maybe better than the solutions we have that are in-house solutions? That's the role of the Office of Innovation, and it's indeed to try and kind of move us over the line in terms of how fast we can move against the challenges that children are facing globally.
Thomas, globally, can you get, Pernilla, some solutions to mental health issues in Sweden too?
That's exactly what we're working on now. So we're discussing with the music industry, we're discussing with other colleagues working here from civil society and trying to figure out, okay, so if we were to use maybe tech in social media to act as, for instance, some flags that could be identified in the terminology that is being used when young people engage with themselves. Because as we know, part of the challenge with mental health is that young people do not, even when they have good relationship with their parents, they don't talk to their mental health with their parents. They talk to their peers. So how can we maybe use tech as a way to create signals for them to realize maybe there is something there and to act as agent of change, to be the agent of their own lives and changement, and maybe for us to give them some guidance about, okay, when you have a peer that has this struggle, how can you refer or what can you guide your peer, your friend towards, so that at least there is a measure of protection for that young person, and that young person does not become an adult with unmanaged, unchecked, unseen.
So you're innovating for Sweden too?
Absolutely.
So Pernilla, UNICEF Sweden traditionally has been working for people far away, children far away, right? So what have you done and what can you do more? And how do you see your remit now, also taking up Thomas's offer here?
I think like Carl said, I think part of the solution has to be partnerships. So I think we really want to be the preferred partner. And we have a lot of data, global data and also data in Sweden. We have two key missions. We want to influence others to do the right thing, including private partners. And we need to mobilize resources. And like you said, citizens of Sweden are doing an amazing job. Just look at how much resources individual Swedes and the private sector has mobilized for the Ukraine. So we have a huge mission in working with engagement of people, both when it comes to influence and income. What can we do more? I think we can do a lot when it comes to involving children and young people. Walking around in Almedalen these days, I do think that we have something. It's not perfect, and if you talk to young people here, we're far from perfect. But I think this is something that I think UNICEF Sweden can contribute with, to be a leader in involving children and young people. Because if we don't involve them, if we don't listen, we don't know what solutions to bring. So I'd like to see the role of Sweden being at the forefront with the private sector, with the government, of course, with our colleagues at UNICEF.
Good. So, Carl, we know Gates it's techie stuff, it's innovation, it's products, right? But there's also this other innovation that I think Pernilla is talking about, innovating in systems and how to deliver services and so on. So what do you see now actually to address the rights crisis to children? Can innovation and systems changes take us out of this?
Yeah, totally. And I think we need to be a bit mindful of using sort of associating buzzwords such as innovation with a technology fix. You know, an app, as good as an app is it going to solve these fundamental issues that you talk about? Innovation, though, is key. And I think one of the things we need to look at is, what are our comparative strengths? We need to be very honest about things we're good at, but we also need to be quite honest about what we're not so good at. And find, to your point, Pernilla, those opportunities where we can partner. It's great that we have goal 17 right behind us or between us here to symbolize that, because partnerships is really the way we move forward. Just as one example, at the end of last year, the Gates Foundation, together with SIDA, worked together on a procurement, on a volume guarantee delivered then by UNICEF to make sure that there was no gap between when developing countries need commodities, and this was in diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines for COVID, but also for other vaccines. So when they need that to when they get it, because often there's a delay between the money coming in from tax revenues to when that can go out and it can be procured.
So it's a short-term credit then?
It's a forgivable sort of loan that we could do that could ensure that there is no gap, using our expertise in building an innovative financial instrument, SIDA's resources, and in this case, UNICEF's amazing ability to deliver to those who need it. So it's smart things such as that, innovations that build on what we're good at and can really deliver to those people who need it, which, as Pernilla also mentioned earlier, let's not forget, the people who have been hit hardest by the pandemic are the ones which are the weakest, the poorest, and the most marginalized. And we've got to make sure that we can build back better and catch up for what we've lost during this pandemic.
Thank you. Let me return to a very critical thing, though. One innovation. I think we've all taken it, almost all of it during the pandemic, a vaccination. And UNICEF buys half the children's vaccines in the world. So, Thomas, is there more to do in vaccines and vaccinations and stuff? And
there's lots more to do, and Carl was describing what we've tried to do, right? Because we buy half of the vaccine in the world, we have some credibility, some trust with member states to be able to help them make this procurement decrease dramatically the price of these vaccines. We're getting into new vaccines, HPV for young people and adolescents being one where we're trying to really go beyond what we were doing before. We're also trying to understand how do we crack that nut of vaccine resistance, which is really growing everywhere in the world, right? How do we get into behavioral science, trying to understand better where does that come from when we've seen the good that it does to everyone and the lives, the hundreds of millions of lives of children that we have saved through vaccination across, and Hans Rosling spoke very well about this. Those statistics really paint a picture of a global good that everybody should want to be associated. How come we're facing not just remaining resistant, but growing resistance? So how do we crack that nut? How do we get into social behavior changes? And also, how are we providing a vaccine that we can demonstrate where is the vaccine procured, when does it arrive at the country level, and all the way up to the arm of the child or an adult if it's a COVID vaccine. Those traceability are becoming better and better. We're innovating around those as well, so that also people can build trust in that. They know where it comes from. There's no game about whatever they may think, and that we are able to give them full transparency about that. Beyond vaccinations, there is going to be a whole lot of work to be done around health strengthening, right? Like the COVID crisis has impacted the health systems in a major way, and in a number of countries that has meant other people not getting care. Mothers not giving birth in a healthcare center because there was nobody to take care of them, children dying of other diseases, again, because the healthcare system was overwhelmed. So there's a lot of innovations about how do we learn from this again and help this system getting back on its feet, but also becoming stronger and more resilient.
I trained as a medical doctor, and then I came out of medical school and I got into this public health and global health. And then I actually, at the time, around 1990, 12.5 million children died before their 5th birthday. But actually now it's 5 million. So we've never reduced child mortality as fast in the history of the world as we have since 1990 now, in the last, whatever it is, mathematics is hard. Yes. But is it a question about medical doctors and healthcare? Certainly vaccines are important, but we heard it's much more than vaccines, actually. But what I've learned, if you look evidence-based at this, it's actually all the various sectors. And maybe school teachers actually are more responsible for declining child mortality, and water engineers and so on. It's a multi-sectoral progress and success story that we've seen, which is now, we've heard, it's still going down, but in some places it's... And yet we remain with 5 million children dying before their 5th birthday. So recognizing, Pernilla, the limits of me as a medical doctor, what can I do? What's the next step now to take us further? Because certainly any child's death is a tragedy, but it's also very bad for the whole sustainable development. Because I think evidence-based, as Hans Rosling taught me, if you lose one child, you're going to replace it with more than one child. So the key to actually reducing population growth is making sure all children survive. So Pernilla, what's the way forward now?
Well, I mean, we have an enormous challenge ahead of us, but I do think that I have never felt that we have a closer agenda with, for instance, the private sector and the public right now. There is convergence among many key actors in the private sector and the public sector on what we have to do. I think UNICEF, as Thomas described, we have an incredible outreach. We are vaccinating, like you said, 45% of every child in the world up to 5. We have the outreach, but we need the resources sometimes, and we need to add the involvement of the children and on innovation systems to think and find new ways of doing it. But I do think that Agenda 2030 has brought a lot of key actors together. But for me, what is missing is involvement of children so that we do the right thing. The integration, like you told, this is something that has to be done in many sectors, not the usual suspects, not only the child rights ministers or the doctors, but integration. And then at the end of the day, we need investments. And these are investments, because what happens around the world is going to come back to us. And I'm very happy to hear when we talk about in the private sector, they do see it as investments. While many governments still talk about aid, while it is an investment for the common good for this We Are One planet. So I think a lot of opportunities, but we have to step up together and make more people sort of join this movement.
Good. Stepping up together. I mean, the pandemic was a huge challenge to all of us. And I think there are many lessons that have been pointed out by the evaluations and so on, where the world could have done better to prevent the pandemic. And I think the world actually agreed in the World Health Assembly now to negotiate a pandemic treaty, which actually means a treaty between all the nation states in the world actually to prevent, detect and respond to a possible next pandemic better. So, question, Carl, is there something, do you see, can it become more than the next virus? Can this pandemic treaty really take us forward to work together, maybe in the spirit of what Pernilla just described?
Well, I think anything we can do that can help drive progress is good. And the spirit of the pandemic treaty, I think, is the right one. There's some question, though, around the structure of the treaty, because I think it'd be quite difficult for some nation states to sign it and to ratify it. I think, for instance, it's very unlikely that the United States will sign it and ratify it, but they should still be a part of it and voluntarily contribute to it. So whether you call it a treaty or a party or a Congress of the party, it doesn't matter so much. But I think the spirit is right. But I also think we need to learn the lessons from this pandemic. And there's some good lessons and there's some bad lessons. But whatever we call this treaty or the equivalent of it, we need to make sure that we avoid some of those mistakes. First of all, I think we need to make sure that lower middle income countries are fully integrated into the decision-making process, which they weren't this time around. We need to make sure there's transparency. We need to make sure that in that transparency, that there's a separation between those who provide the funding for it and those who set a strategy for it. Just because you give a lot of money as a country shouldn't mean that you make the decisions on how it's run. And then finally, I think it's really important that we also leverage the existing institutions and also the architecture. We don't want to duplicate what's already out there. It needs to be complementary, and it needs to add to it so we can drive progress in terms of that. At the Gates Foundation, we call ourselves impatient optimists. We're optimistic because despite the setbacks, we believe that progress not only is possible, but we will achieve more progress. And your statistics are are wonderful in that respect. Let's remember, and I think all of us in this tent, when we speak to others, say, oh, you work with development or invest in development issues. Is there actually anything happened there? The answer to that is yes, absolutely. There is progress. We've had setbacks, but there is sort of progress, and we need to make sure we drill that home. And one of the things that we're concerned about at the Gates Foundation, and many of you in this tent are as well, is that countries are starting to waver a little bit. We have decisions in some countries, the Kingdom, for instance, decided to cut their development assistance from 0.7 to 0.5. Some discussions here in Sweden over the elections. We need to be very strong and forceful, say we need to invest in this, and we need to do it for the long term.
What's your take on that, Pernilla? I mean, we have an election this fall, and this is under discussion and happening in seminars here. What's your take on that, development aid and Sweden's role?
I really hope, and I am hopeful that Sweden will continue to be a leader, because if a country like Sweden start to talk about not having the resources to both fix challenges at home and abroad. Of course, we have so many countries that could follow, less rich than Sweden. And what I see in Almedalen, not least the push for the civil society, we are in unanimity here. We want to see investments both in Sweden and globally. And I think we have also, this year, the private sector have never invested so much in UNICEF. It would be strange to see governments all of a sudden pulling away. So I'm hopeful, but we cannot give up. We have to continue to fight and to argue, like you said, that there are progress and we can make more progress. And we are not like, bureaucrats and old school. We are working with the best of innovators, with the top tech or top social innovation. So, work with us. We can do it, and we can, do the right thing. We will fix this.
It's good. What do you say about tried and tested things like giving everyone access to basic health care? Is that a good idea or not? To me, it seems like the ultimate answer to many of these challenges that we're talking about, that people in many countries around the world, they don't have access to decent health care. Any thoughts on that? I mean, building the system, really, to deliver...
Take a first stab at it. Absolutely. And that's the amazing thing about making these investments. You asked about the pandemic treaty. Making investment in pandemic preparedness, which is what the treaty is all about, is the right thing to do. It's not just for pandemics. You get all kinds of other great benefits by investing in that, including, of course, in health systems. And there's lots of wonderful examples of when we've invested in one thing that has benefits in another thing. Just give me one example. The Gates Foundation, with UNICEF and many others probably in this room, have worked on polio for a long time. One of the things polio pioneered was to do testing in sewage systems. So in sewage system, you can test to see if there's polio traces in the system. That pioneering system that's in place for polio can now be used for things like COVID. And underlying all of this is, of course, health system strengthening. So absolutely, we have to invest in that, because that's the foundation of it all.
Yeah. So what will it take to give everyone access to basic health services in the world? I mean, is there innovation? And how much of it is pure grit and governments actually getting serious about it? Thomas, you've been around the world for UNICEF.
Yes, a few 22 years. But I mean, it is certainly part of what UNICEF innovation is trying to go, is what we call innovative finance mechanism and different innovations around this. This is even broader than this, right? Because part of the issue that you have in many countries of the world is that you talk about this, and it has been proven multiple times by science and by countries that indeed universal healthcare is generally very low cost to a given country and has immense and long-term benefits to economic development, healthcare, and even the well-being of its population. So that's proven, and yet it's not happening. And why? In many of the countries we work in, they're servicing their debts, right? 15, 20% of a government's budget goes into debt servicing. So when you talk to them about new investments, they see the optics, but the finance ministry says, yes, but I'm being asked for new investments on health, on education, on water, on COVID, and I only have 100. So how do I make these choices? That's part of what we would like to see, a broader discussion from the COVID pandemic, because it's impacting all nations of the world, economically speaking, and it's having an immense impact on global debt as well. So can we maybe start there and discuss either a moratorium or some kind of way to lower the threshold on the weight on these particularly developing countries, who are all saying, you're asking us to do the same efforts, more efforts than anybody else on climate change when our economy is not ready, and we have to do all of this simultaneously while servicing the debt, mostly to the global north. Right, so it feels like are struggling to make these choices that maybe from an outside look obvious choices.
And as we started out with, some of these needs are actually increasing with multiple crises and the climate crisis, which ultimately translate to a health and development crisis. That macro international relation, but if we're inside a country, I know UNICEF likes voice, Pernilla, young people getting a voice and saying this is our future and our development. But what about accountability? Can they hold their leaders to account?
Well, I do think that we've been talking a lot in Almedalen about the crisis of democracy, and a lot of young people in Sweden and around the world feel very far away from what we are talking about now. They feel uninformed, they feel unlistened to. So I do think that we ministers and everybody in decision-making positions will have to go up and explain much more what did I do and what will I do, so that young people can actually scrutinize and follow. I think UNICEF has a fantastic instrument, and I hope we're going to launch it in Sweden, called U-Reporters. Because often also in Almedalen, we have brilliant young people around here, but it is not all young people. It is not every child. There are children that don't have the resources to come to Almedalen. In other countries, who will never be asked for their voice. So I do like very much what UNICEF is doing with U-Reporters, which is an app. They can, as we know, can be very useful with the right people and the right tech, that we can get their voices. And I do think that if politicians or decision makers know that we have 60,000 young people in a country that UNICEF can be in dialogue with, we can check. We built a school, were the teachers coming, and did you learn something? I think the young people will help the decision makers to deliver and to hold them accountable. So let's say young people can help, but the adults need to take the first step forward and say, here I am, I'm going to try to do this, I'll listen to you, come back to me. It's a difficult question, but something is happening.
But is there any innovation around the corner then, Thomas, there for governance and accountability?
So we hope. So indeed, coming back to where U-Report was born and why was it born? It was born to look at accountability frameworks. Right? It was born in Uganda, and the optics was to say, in many times, children would go to school. Parents would actually, make the effort of investing in children's uniforms, school bags, which again is a big part of their budget. And then their child would go to school and would find no teachers, or they would go to the health center and there would be no health worker. And so we invented that application that was simply saying, you report it. And so it was simple. It was SMS initially. It was just text message. No smartphone was necessary. And it worked so well because it aggregated data. So without individualizing the feedback loop, it aggregated data so everybody felt safe. And we were able to then say to the government of Uganda, so in that zone, 40% of your teachers are not coming to school at all. Let's find out why. Is it because they're not well paid enough? Is it because they don't feel safe on the road? What is it that is keeping that not working? And that worked so well, it was so impactful. We also used it in Uganda, for instance. At some point, the government was discussing, should we continue female genital mutilation? And we told them, well, we don't think young people really want that or care about that. And we said, okay, let's do a poll. And 85% of these young people, men and women, said, no, we want to stop it. And so thanks to that, they just had the courage to then say, our new constituency is telling us to stop that. So part of what we are hoping, we have 22 million new reporters now in 40 plus countries of the world. We want now for them to also speak back. So far it's been adults asking questions about what adults thought was important to young people. We want that to be a two-way street. And for them to say, hello, you haven't asked me about that particular aspect of climate change, or I've been telling you this 2 years ago. How do we break that silence? Because quite often they do feel unlistened and unheard, even when they do speak out.
Okay, thank you. We have a few minutes and we have a very unheard audience here. Do we have a question from the audience? And is there a microphone even? Otherwise, I will repeat the question. Any question from the audience? Josephine, please. Now, I know you, but who are you? Please.
Yes, I'm the Secretary General of LM International, and we work a lot with UNICEF at country level. It's actually our biggest partner. When it comes to the global level, it is sometimes a very complex, innovative ecosystem, how you navigate. And I would actually like to hear the panel, how do we make sure that innovation is locally rooted? So there's not too much of a gap between the country level and the innovations we drive in communities in countries such as Sudan, Somalia, versus what we do at the global level. Sometimes innovation becomes a bit of a buzzword, business at the global level, but it's important. And it is rooted, but how can we make the connection stronger?
Wow, who'd like to take a stab at that? Good question.
So maybe I'll start. So first, what we're trying to do is first becoming more disciplined about it, right? So part of what we realized is that we were doing a lot of innovations in various ways. We were struggling, however, to actually learn from each other and to learn from these innovations what is working, what is not working. So we are now becoming a lot more disciplined about trying to have not a better knowledge management, but also being systematic in saying what is the impact on that innovation on the ground, and then being able to say, okay, so Uganda is working on an innovation around healthcare, and so is Tanzania, but across the last 2 years, the impact on children seems to be better in Tanzania. What are they doing that is different? And is that context specific? Or could we actually test that as well in Uganda or elsewhere and figure out whether maybe it's not context specific, so that we keep learning from each other and learning from other organizations. That's also something that we are trying to be a lot more intentional around, because UNICEF is a very large organization, and as all large organizations, we have a tendency to think that we have all of the answers. We have many answers, but clearly, if we had them all, we would be much further along.
Good. Carl, I know Gates is starting an Africa office there now. Is that a way to try to address some of these contextualization challenges that are faced? And their innovation about youth centers in low-income neighborhoods of Nairobi won the Morgan Stanley Innovation Award, is now taken to New York City, I understand. So that is, I think, global collaboration and the capacity for reciprocal learning. We have another question from the gentleman here, please. Oh, this is being signed.
Yeah. Hello, my name is Göran Alfredsson, and I'm the president of My Right. I'm sorry, I came in the middle of the seminar, but it was so exciting, so I couldn't stop listening. I'm working with the people with disabilities in the whole world, globally, and you talk about asking the youth, how is it in school, what do you want, what do you need, but you have to include the young people with disabilities, with the various of functions. And do you do that in your all good prospects here, I ask?
Thank you very much. Yes. 10% of us in the world have some kind of disability. And typically those, particularly children, are not care, etc. So who would like to speak to that?
I can start perhaps by saying that in some areas, the pandemic and the fact that we had to move on to digital meetings and digital conversation, we did a hack with children around the globe, where children were supposed to solve problems they've had. And because we didn't ask children to come to a specific town, to come to a specific room, we had so many more children, not every child, but we had so many more children with disabilities. And in fact, during the pandemic, there were some more equal situations for a child that was mostly spent time in his or her room because she couldn't physically leave the apartment. And all of a sudden, this girl was sitting with children around the world and was doing a hack. And nobody on the screen could see any difference between this child and another child. It's only a beginning, but we have to remember that UNICEF is working for every child. And I think we have to do much more. But I think we can see a lot of opportunities, and the tech, together with Gates Foundation, Toma Innovation, we can innovate here. listening to the children concerned, what would work for you? I can't know. You have to tell us.
I was actually, when I was the global chief of health for UNICEF, I was involved in setting up a development project around children with disability. Because for the most children who are born, it's not apparent from birth that there is a functional variation. So you need to discover it. And the earlier you discover it, the better services you can provide to the children so that they actually have a better outcome. And in fact, through UNICEF Sweden and a gift from H&M Foundation, we were in a position now to develop a program guidance for early screening in health facilities, by community health workers, to identify functional variation and disability early and respond early in the community, to make sure that in many communities we actually find and include these children who could otherwise have been hidden away due to stigma. And from the initial countries where this was implemented, it's actually now spreading from UNICEF office to office and to across many countries. So there is innovation in, not necessarily, there was no techie stuff in that, but it was actually a social innovation. Carl.
Thank you very much for your question. I think it's a really pertinent point. At the Gates Foundation, our motto is a little bit similar, is all lives have equal value. And we've started a pretty deliberate process over the last couple of years to integrate what we call DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. So irrespective of where you are, who you are, you should be integrated and included. And that's both for people that work for the foundation, so when we recruit for people, when we have advisors, consultants, but equally in all our programs. Every grant that we disperse now has a DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion component to it. So we have to make sure we address and do it. I fully agree with you. We need to do more. We can do better, but we have to do better, all of us.
Brilliant. Thomas?
So I'm, of course, by the nature of my job, I'm an optimist. I'm also impatient, but that's, I think, my personality. I'm also French, so I'm maybe a bit harsher. I don't think we do good enough on children with disability. I think we still have a lot of progress to make as an organization. We are not where we should be. We are doing, however, much better continuously. So in health, for instance, we're just working with a cry whisperer program, which essentially analyzes how babies, infants are crying, because it seems that this is the earliest indicator of potential both mental health and various disabilities. So some really exciting things are coming up. We're also working using technology to do learning pathways that are specifically designed for children with autism and learning disability, and they're proving incredibly successful. And indeed, when we do ideation with young people at the center, we are creating a lot of excitement across the peers, because when we do challenges, children with disability often win the challenges. Because, I don't know why. Maybe they want to shine more, maybe because they're struggling more in life, they are just brimming with ideas. And the fact that they continue to generally win or be really runner-ups in the challenges, bring their own communities with a desire to engage with them more. So there's a lot of gains that are happening there that give hope, I think.
Okay, so we are nearing the end of this seminar, and the seminar is entitled, How Can We Secure Children's Right to Life and Development in the Wake of the Pandemic? And then we've realized we have many more crises now and well. So can you summarize, what's your answer to that? The title is a question, isn't it? Children's Rights to Life and Development in the Wake of Pandemic. We talked a lot about innovations and systems building and so on, but what are you going across the board here? What's your answer to the question in the title of our seminar today?
Me first. Quick answer, I presume you want. So I'm gonna say what Warren Buffett tells us every year. Warren Buffett, as many of you know, has been very generous with giving quite a large portion of his wealth to the foundation. And every year when we meet with him as the whole foundation, he gets up on stage, he gives a very motivating and powerful speech, and then he always says, beware the ABCs. Beware the ABCs. Beware of arrogance, beware of bureaucracy, and beware of complacency. And he leaves us with those words, reminding us every year. And I think in your question, I think we need to be mindful of that. So we don't fall into old patterns, we don't get complacent, and we keep on working for these issues that are so important.
Brilliant. Pernilla, what's your take?
I think that I think you who said there were good lessons learned, and there were positive examples and bad examples. I think the worst example and what we learned: no decision without a children's right assessment, children's risk assessment. We cannot close schools and expect no consequences, and broad consequences. So we have to learn that we have to do an assessment of children's rights in decisions that we make. I think that we have to take with us. We did a lot of good things when it comes to water and sanitation. There was an interest in the world in clean water, in investment in water and sanitation. We showed to the world that the basic boring work that many of us sometimes feel we are doing is a huge value to humanity, and not only in the country over there, but for all around the world. So I think there are some good examples of investment we have to continue to do, and then things we never should do again, like closing those schools without any plan B on how to deliver education.
Thank you. Thomas?
So first, the pandemic is not behind us. In most of the countries in the global south, they are living the pandemic, right? Many of them are still not vaccinated today. So these kind of meetings without masks is unthinkable in many of the countries that we work in the global south. So that's the first bit. And to me, we haven't seen the beginning of how deeply that crisis will impact on children. We're starting to see some signals. We're starting to see some data points. It's going to get a lot worse in many respects. The good part of that is that I think it has awoken a desire by so many partners, because they've been impacted at the same time, right? This is a global pandemic, to say, okay, how do we manage this? How do we do this? And it has brought new partnership. It has brought new desire to collaborate. And I'm very much a believer that those new partnerships, that new energy can help us really change the world much faster if we are aware of our own arrogance and our complacency, and if we work on bureaucracies, which for the UN is not always a given, but that's part of why I love innovation. We must keep those lessons very much at the forefront of our minds and of our hearts if we want to have a chance to overcome the kind of losses that we've seen in so many social indicators.
Thank you, panel. And ladies and gentlemen, the pandemic is not over for COVID. It's certainly not over for the education crisis, and there are a number of multiple crises. Building health systems have a number of nuts and bolts to them. Oxygen is one. I think we had a lot of progress in oxygen systems, which goes far beyond COVID, and it saves a lot of children's, particularly newborns' lives. We have seen that much as we're pushing to immunize people still around the world against COVID, we need to innovate and build the cold chain for the children in good shape. But we also need to innovate actually in the behavioral systems that build trust and acceptability so that actually people stick their arm forward. And finally, we need the health workers. There's no running away from building a health system that has competent health workers that are trained, paid, and can actually build trust with communities to deliver these services for children into the future and to realize their rights. This has been a seminar organized by UNICEF with participation from Gates Foundation, UNICEF Sweden, UNICEF Office of Innovation. I'm Stefan Swartling-Peterson from Karolinska Institutet and UNICEF, and thank you very much for tuning in today and to coming here.